My name is Richard August, and I'll be your host. Our guest is Harrison Tuttle, Executive Director of Black Lives Matter Rhode Island Political Action Committee. Welcome to State of the State.
Thanks for having me.
Mr. Tuttle, tell our audience about yourself, your background, education, occupation, whatever. Go ahead.
Sure. I went to Bishop Hendricken High School. I graduated years ago in 2018. And from there, I went to CCRI as a part of a 2 free-year program that's going on in the state of Rhode Island at CCRI in Warwick, and where I was pursuing and received my associate's degree in early education. And throughout that time, there was obviously the pandemic, but most importantly, the 2020 protests over George Floyd's killing. And that really, part of me wanted to be able to be a part of an organization that was bigger than myself and that fought for a cause that was important to me, in which I joined BLM-RI PAC and kind of started as communications director, and then in March became executive director, and since then I've done this full time. As you know, I've really been able to not only help the organization, but also run for office, which I'm sure that we'll talk about in this later.
Well, you are a declared Democrat candidate for District 28 seat in the state Senate, and you thought your opponent would be the incumbent liberal Democrat Joshua Miller, but according to the 2 revised redistricting maps, you would face freshman progressive Senator Kendra Anderson, who currently represents District 31. Now, Enrique Sanchez, the political director of your organization, said, and I quote, "It is clear there is an attempt to redistrict out allies and prominent up-and-coming leaders such as yourself on purpose." Do you want to add to his comment?
Sure. I think there really hasn't been any decision made, especially with the different maps that are going on that will be approved by the General Assembly next year in January. I really think that running for office is something that not only do I take extremely seriously, but I know many others in the state who are progressives take seriously. And so I really want to be able to talk with family and friends and other people in the community before making that decision and announcing. But certainly the changes in districts is going to play a huge factor in my decision making.
So you would not want to run against Ms. Anderson?
Well, I mean, it's one of the options if the map stays the same, but I also have the House of Representatives in District 16 as presently constructed. That has not changed. That representative is Brandon Potter, who's also a freshman progressive. And so I'm just weighing my options and really seeing what the best role in the community, because ultimately I'm running not for myself, but for the city of Cranston and ultimately my district.
Okay. Now, your website says BLM-RI PAC was formed on July 7th, 2020 by a group of protesters who describe themselves as BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color, and that, and I quote, "People of color and poor people are not represented in government across the state." Are you a diverse organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I believe that not only have we advocated for Black, Indigenous, people of color throughout the state, but it is also a reflection of what our mission is, which is to have a diverse government in Rhode Island. When you look at the State House and you look at the majority of people that are in the State House, it's older white men specifically. And I believe that in order to have a government that works for everybody, we need to have a diverse group of people that represents entire areas of Rhode Island, and which I don't believe that's the case right now.
Are there white people in your organization?
There is.
Okay. And what do you mean by not represented? That there's not enough, as you just said, BIPOC people in state and local government, or that their interests are not being represented?
Well, I believe it's both, right? Not only do we need people up in the General Assembly and all forms of government, but we also need the people at the table to be able to represent the best interest of everyday Rhode Islanders, whereas specifically working class Rhode Islanders is the term that you'll see a lot of progressive use. And what that means is that we need a government that serves people who are working 9 to 5 and not people who are just prioritized, who, let's say, are wealthy or upper middle class.
Can a white person represent the interest of BIPOC constituents?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
How many members does BLM-RI PAC have at present?
So the way our organization is structured, we have an executive board committee that's made up of 5 members and soon to be growing. And then we also have an advisory committee. That advisory committee is made up of people throughout the community representing different organizations and different interests, straying from a wide range of BIPOC and white folks that strictly do the endorsement process and hold what we would call the staff accountable. And so I do not make any endorsements. It comes from the community. That's how we structured our organization, to be able to have that responsibility and trust for our elected officials.
Why is your organization a political action committee rather than a nonprofit political entity?
Sure. Well, a lot of the challenges that the Black Lives Matter movement has had, or any movement, is how do we get ourselves from protests to creating action? And unfortunately, there are a lot of things that were called throughout the summer and throughout the history of this country that really haven't been met by elected officials. And one of the biggest challenges for people of color running for office is they don't have that wide range of people that they can reach out to and say, hey, I need a maximum contribution, or I need money to run for office. And so what the PAC has done is it has provided an opportunity for not only Black Lives Matter to take a movement from the protests to the General Assembly and above, but it has also helped us legally be able to provide money and different things to help candidates who are running for office. We have money, we are hosting fundraisers, et cetera.
So the PAC is a 501c4 under the Internal Revenue Code, which means contributions are not tax deductible?
It is a political action committee, so we are not a 501c4, which is very different from a lot of the other organizations you see. PACs traditionally are more under the radar, don't really get talked about. Typically more corporate PACs are what we see.
Or union PACs.
Or union PACs. Yeah. What we are is we're, I would say, an involvement of the Black Lives Matter movement, in which we're extremely unique, in which there's no BLM PACs in anywhere throughout the country. And so super thankful for not only the community, but also nationwide for people who have donated to our organization that has ultimately helped us help candidates of color get into office and continue to.
Let's talk about the Black Lives Matter movement in general. Now, the national BLM website says, and I quote, in 2013, 3 radical black organizers, Alicia Garza, Patrisse Cullors, and Opal Tometi, created a black-centered political will and movement building project called #Black Lives Matter. It was in response to the acquittal of Trayvon Martin's murderer, George Zimmerman, close quote. So the movement began really like as a social media event, didn't it? Mm-hmm. And the website goes on, and I quote again, Black Lives Matter is an ideological and political intervention in a world where black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise, and build local power to intervene in violence and inflicted on black communities by the state and vigilantes, end of quote. Do you believe that the United States is a racist society where black lives are systematically and intentionally targeted for demise?
Well, I think that we have to look at multiple systems. I don't think that there is one red thing that we can point to that says, hey, this is what is ultimately the reason why black people have historically been systematically affected by racism. I think when we look at the overall aspect of systemic racism, I think we have to look at a litany of things: the criminal justice system. We need to look at healthcare, our education system. And so all of these are not mutual, but they're very much intersectional. And so when, the term is America racist, I think that we have to look at the structures. And I think certainly, we have made a lot of progress in this country, but we still have a lot of ways to go. We still have a lot of room to be able to not only build equity in this country for Black people, but also make sure that, things like George Floyd dying and cases of police brutality, specifically in Rhode Island, Sale Street, in which we saw Black and brown kids get pepper sprayed. These instances are instances of police brutality, but are not mutual to the overall effects of what we see throughout the country and also through our systems.
Now, one of the founders of BLM, specifically Patrisse Cullors, has stated publicly that she and the other founders are, quote, trained Marxists. Are you a Marxist, Mr. Tuttle?
Well, I'm a progressive. And so I believe that people deserve the right to housing, people deserve the right for health care, people deserve a quality education. And I believe that in this world of, labels, if I were to give myself a label, I would define myself as a democratic socialist.
Now, Ms. Cullors has become quite wealthy as a result of the money that's poured into the BLM National, and she has 4 houses now in Tony areas of California, and she's reportedly looking at an estate in the Cayman Islands. That doesn't sound Marxist to me, does it to you?
Well, I can't speak on her purchases in life. I think that everybody deserves to have housing. I think that the world that we live in very much a capitalist society, allows folks to, have money where some don't. And I think, speaking for myself, I'm hoping that Rhode Island builds into a place in which people have money and people have the resources that they need to be able to provide for themselves. Basic needs like housing and shelter, or housing and food and healthcare. But I can't speak on individuals and how that overall affects the movement. I think that's just one person who's played a huge impact, but I don't think that that reflects the BLM movement as a whole.
Okay. Now, specifically, your website lists the goals of BLM-RI PAC as repealing the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, reallocating funding for social services, legalizing marijuana, which I guess is going to happen, and banning for-profit prisons, among others. Let's look at them individually, okay?
Sure.
Now, the police unions say that the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights is needed to protect cops from retribution by elected officials and being tried in the media. I went on a ride-along with a city police department, and the field training officer I was with said that if you are a cop, you will be second-guessed by the press, the public, the politicians, and even your superior officers. Why do you say that LEOBAR needs to be repealed and not just perhaps modified?
Well, I think it's really simple. If George Floyd died outside of our studio today, that officer would have not only a paid suspension, but would also not be able to be adequately judged as any other citizen would be. In fact, what LEOBAR does is it creates a lack of accountability and creates that police chief to not be able to discipline that own officer. And so when we look at police doing something wrong, in which this is what it is for, I would hope that police officers who are public servants, if they do something wrong, would like to be treated just like anybody else. Right? If a doctor made a mistake, we wouldn't be like, well, let's give him a break. If a pilot, was made a mistake, we wouldn't do it. In no other profession would we ask that. And although the circumstances are different, I think that if officers do something wrong, they should be able to be judged just like anybody else.
So you would rather repeal that Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, it can't be modified, just want it repealed?
Well, I don't think that, the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights is needed. Not only do other states throughout the country not have this, but we are the only New England state that doesn't, that has it. So when we look at, well, do we need it? Do we not? Does it need to be modified? Well, how do officers in New York get judged? How do people in Massachusetts get judged? It's no different. It should be no different here. We should be able to look at officers, and if they do something wrong, they should be suspended, and that police chief should have the power to fire them if the police chief determines that is the right action moving forward.
One of the things that you're advocating for is driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. And former Governor Link Chafee was also in favor on the basis that undocumented workers needed to drive to work. Now, first of all, people here who have overstayed their visas or entered the country illegally are not supposed to be working. And in fact, some advocates say it's the employer who should be punished. Please explain your group's position on this issue. Sure.
Well, the position that we're coming from is that we believe that people who want to enter this country should be able to stay in this country. The idea that people who are illegal immigrants are coming to be able to steal jobs is just not true. The fact of the matter is, if someone is here, they should be able to have access to a driver's license so they're able to get a job and provide for their family. And if they're here, and we're of the belief that this country was made up of immigrants and people who have come from out of this country, that I'm of the belief that they should have the same opportunities that others had when specifically my family, parts of my family came over from the boat from Italy.
So are you saying you are in favor of open borders? Anybody should be able to enter the country? Anybody who wants to come here?
Well, I think that that is a different conversation at more of a national level. I would say that at a state level, I don't think that we're seeing people coming from Massachusetts or New York or surrounding states who are illegal from the border. I would say that the people who are here should be able to stay and should have the same rights as any other human being should have, which is shelter and the ability to create a living, to be able to have the basic needs to survive.
So, but personally, on a personal level, do you believe we should have open borders, or should we have some control over the flow of immigrants from, any direction?
So I think the design and the implementation is very different, but when we look at the overall concept, in my belief, I believe that we should have people come into this country and open borders, but I believe that there should be a system in which we're able to make sure that people are safe, people are, been able to receive the necessary care that they need. Yeah, I think that we should have an opportunity to have people who want to come to this country to be able to do that.
Okay, Rhode Island does not require, as you probably know, proof of citizenship to register to vote. So what is to keep a non-citizen from registering to vote and showing their driver's license when they cast a ballot?
Well, if that person is living and participating in life in Rhode Island, I feel like that person should have the right to be able to participate in our democracy. If that person wants to stay in Rhode Island, that person should be able to know what the governing laws are so they can change it if they don't feel like that is what they want.
So non-citizens should have the right to vote in state, local, and national elections?
I believe that anybody who is in this country deserves to play a part in our democracy, yes.
One of the, you are against, when I say you, your organization is against what you call for-profit prisons. And does this go back to the situation at the Wyatt Detention Center in which a demonstrator was run over by a guard reporting for work? Was that the genesis of this drive against for-profit prisons?
Well, what for-profit prisons do is is exactly what it says. It makes profit off people who are incarcerated. And from the perspective of Black Lives Matter, a large percentage of people, or actually the majority of people that are incarcerated are Black and brown folks, not only throughout the country, but in the state. And so specifically, we do not want our people making profit off of incarcerated folks, regardless of what color you are, but specifically it is a Black and brown issue because of the amount of people who are, which goes back to the overall systemic issues that our country faces, which is a result of, racism.
Your website claims, and I'm quoting, "For-profit prisons have a financial incentive to lock people in jail even if they've done nothing wrong." I thought the courts and the judicial system design who belongs in jail, not the prisons.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're very much intertwined. We see that Black and brown folks have been historically incarcerated at a higher rate than white folks in this country, right? And so when we see how prisons have been built and have been, essentially a profit, it's called the prison industrial complex, that prison or for-profit prisons makes money off the incarceration of Black and brown folks, and which is built off of Black people being unlawfully arrested for a variety of reasons, whether it's having higher sentences due to crimes compared to white people, et cetera.
I'm still a little bit confused because the same thing, whether it's a for-profit prison or a state-run like the ACI, it's not the prisons that are going to dictate who's there. It's the judicial system, the courts and the judicial system, right? And are you saying that you object to the fact that a private entity who runs a prison is somehow making a profit, that is the objection? What if it was a break even?
Well, what we see that communities that are affected by this are predominantly Black and brown folks, and we see that for-profit prisons have historically been in a position to capitalize financially on the overall systemic issues.
Your organization has also come out in favor of no cash bail, which seems to be creating chaos where it is being observed, like New York City, for example. Last week, a homeless, mentally challenged man with a criminal record was set fire to the large Christmas tree outside of Fox News in Manhattan. The company replaced it within 24 hours, and the perpetrator was on the scene when it was rededicated. But many other more serious incidents have occurred involving repeat offenders who have been arrested, turned back on the street, only to quickly reoffend. Now, how do you propose we solve the problem you say exists and protect society at the same time?
Well, we have to look at what cash bail does. Mm-hmm. And what cash bail does is, for a large percentage of people, those are serious situations. For a large percentage of people that are in prison that have not been brought to court, they cannot afford the price in which it takes to be able to get back out on the street and go through the judicial process. So that specifically is a problem, and I think that is a reflection in which we've seen places like New York and other places. For every situation that you brought up, there's a situation in which someone is in Rikers Island for 3 years and commits suicide after going through years of physical and mental trauma because of the fact that they cannot afford cash bail.
So you're saying that people are held at Rikers Island for 3 years before they even come to trial?
Based off the judicial process in which cases are heard, it can be pushed back. I'm drawing a blank on the person's name. But what we see is people who are on cash bail are held because they can't afford to get out. So that is a combination of not only systemic but equity issues in our state, and specifically larger in our community. And when we see people of color traditionally not come from backgrounds in which they can afford to have a $1,000 or even a $500 bail set for them.
Is it possible to address this concern by, say, having a sliding scale of based on the person's income or wealth, that they could have a sliding scale to set the cash bail. So a person of color or with little or no means, would not have $1 or $10 or something, but someone with means could have $100,000. Is that a way to address this?
Well, I think that ending cash bail completely is a solution that we need to go towards. When we look at, well, this person has this amount of money, this person has this amount of money, it's a situation of equity in which we see people that are coming from different backgrounds, specifically white people, are able to historically pay those bails at a percentage higher than black and brown folks. And ultimately, those people are going to go through the same judicial process, whether they are in jail or whether they are not in jail. And if the bail is set and they can come up with the money, then it is deemed by the courts that they can be released out to the public. This isn't a conversation centered around whether they should be out there. This is a conversation centered around, can they afford it? And if they can't afford it, in which a large percentage of black and brown folks can't, then that's where the ending cash bail conversation comes around. And the BLM-RA PAC is firmly in stance of ending cash bail.
So ending cash bail for anybody, a wealthy individual who's convicted of a serious crime and is subject to a flight risk, they should be allowed out too without a cash bail?
Well, if they're subject to a flight risk, then I'm assuming that is one of the different circumstances in which they would not have bail presented to them. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but I would assume that if someone is a flight risk, they wouldn't have that opportunity to leave the country. I doubt a large percentage of people who are black and brown are a flight risk because they don't have access to those funds, historically.
We have about 3 minutes left, and I do want to get to one other question. You talk about allocating money to social services, which is another, I think, a catchphrase for talking about this issue of defunding the police. But you talk about reallocating money to social services, and you are in favor, when I say you, your organization are in favor of sending a social worker to de-escalate domestic violence calls and those involving drug overdoses and mental health crises. Do you really think that social workers are better trained and equipped to handle that kind of a situation?
Absolutely. And what we see is throughout the country, in places like Eugene, Oregon, Denver, and even the President of the United States, Joe Biden, agrees when he allocated or put a part of his plan in the ARPA spending, in which our state still hasn't spent, to services such as that. In fact, I have been on a steering committee in Providence this past year, creating this program, and the conversation of safety for social workers and behavioral health specialists to be able to go to these situations was a topic of discussion. The reality is 97% of calls in Rhode Island that is received are nonviolent. And so we're not seeing a case in which police are responding to a high number of violent crimes in which they're needed. And so when we look at being able to meet people where they're at and improving public safety, I don't think that it is a case of defunding here, increasing funding here. I look at it as a public safety issue, and I look at it as being able to better serve Rhode Islanders in this state.
Well, we are just about out of time, believe it or not, and it's been a very interesting discussion. We want to thank you for joining us on State of the State, and if your candidacy for either the House or the Senate is firmed up, please come back and talk to us again, okay?
Absolutely.
Great.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.